Welcome. Thanks for all of you showing up here. They told me 20, 30 people, but there's a lot more of you. So great to have you here. I was asked to do a workshop on ASP.NET Core 2.1 and making it like professional ones. And then they said it's 2 times 40 minutes, which is kind of a challenge. So what I did, I prepared a couple of things, some small bit of slides just to get you guys in and girls in the right place. And I will just take you through some code, but everybody that has a laptop, you can follow along because everything is online. And let's see how that works out. So bear with me. It will be improvised and you can ask questions. I will just slowly go through this journey from starting with file new project, doing a new project in ASP.NET Core, where you get the template with the values controller, and then you start building your things. I'm Alex Thissen. I didn't introduce myself, but I'm a consultant or cloud architect in the Netherlands. And every now and again, we are asked to go to customers where they're struggling because their application doesn't scale well. Well, they put it in the cloud and they said it scales well, but it also scales their problems. And when you get there, they're like, if you ask them, okay, so show me some insights in your application. What is it doing? And they say, I don't know, we just build, the get method and we put stuff in there, and that's where we are. So it's quite a journey to get from documentation to telemetry to health status and all these things. What I think, okay, that's from your web application or web API to becoming more robust, production ready. And it takes a lot of things. So the agenda for today, there's some code involved, obviously, is where we envision you have your web API and you're implementing it, and you know better than I do what you need to do to implement your web API. So what's inside of all the methods, all the REST actions that you can call. But in general, there's your logic and there's external resources involved. So we'll take that as an example. And for the demo, I had to come up with something a bit neutral. So I thought genealogy, which is about family history trees and all. And it's a very small thing that we're going to talk about, because essentially what we're looking at is you want to build your web API and you can do stuff related to family history, family trees. It's not in there at all, except there's one thing to highlight all of the things that we want to cover. That's an external API that we want to call. And I think that's fairly common, that web APIs also leverage other web APIs. Sometimes if you have a microservices architecture, one web API or microservice calling another one is part of the patterns that you see. And we can discuss if that's a good one or not. But the external resources that you have are particularly tricky, because if they go out, what will your web API do? So that's the setting. You'll see bits and snippets of that. Assuming that things will break, we will look at resiliency. And I will cover things that are new in ASP.NET Core 2.1, because there's a lot of things that you can do to take care of transient errors. But we'll take a look at Poly, we'll do the typed clients and the Httpclient Factory. That's the new stuff in ASP.NET Core 2.1. We'll look at the open API documentation that you can generate. Normally Swashbuckle, maybe you've heard of it, will be used, but Microsoft is investing heavily into NSWAG, so I picked that library. And we'll also look at the versioning of your API, because it will evolve over time, and you need to take care of that. Then your web API must be consumed, so we'll talk about clients. The 2 things that we will look into as well is auto-rest and refit. And a bit about security. HTTPS and HSTS is also new in ASP.NET Core 2.1. User secrets, key vault to some extent, and a bit about testing. I skipped the part with the unit testing because I think that might have been covered or will probably be covered extensively. But the service contract integration tests will be a nice thing. And finally, operations, checking your health. How is your web API doing? Is it okay? Is it struggling? Should we do something about it? Do we proactively engage? That's the topics that we will cover. So people with laptops, if all goes well and you go to the bit.ly link there, or if you want to type it a bit longer, you can take this URL and leave this out. That's where I have a Git repository with the full solution. And the idea is that we will go back down in history and we'll start building up the entire project. And I'll take you through all the steps as the Web API evolves. That might be me. Let me check. No, that wasn't me. So the slides will be available. You can store the link on your phone, so you can even do this afterwards. That was the idea, that I will walk you through the code so you know where to look, and you can play around with it yourself. It's about patterns and things that you can do and how that works. Yep. Any questions up front? Good question. So let me just go to the website myself. So what I also did, if you go to GitHub, if you go to the URL, what I did, so I built this up yesterday, but it's about what we will cover with the preview 2 bits. And there's an installation list that I built. You might need extra things there, but if you go with Visual Studio 15.6.6, you should be good. It does prompt you with, you should actually have 15.7 preview to get the better experience. But this is the essential set of tooling. And the second bullet is .NET Core 2.1 Preview 2. And this is the GitHub one. I gave you the GitHub link to where the team releases all of its packages, because that might be updated to include newer versions. And there's a bit of a lag behind it appearing there and then appearing on a publicly. There's also an official one. Yeah. So this is what you should be doing, but otherwise just sit back, relax, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So what I'll do now is I'll go to let me see, view history. So this I built up the past couple of days, and you see that I have all these tags at the side, and that's what we'll actually be using, because the file new project is just, well, let's do that first. Because I also did the slide, I shouldn't forget the slides, because that is get started. So if you do this at home and you clone the repository and then do git checkout tags/start, you'll actually go back in time to this one and get that one. Now I should be careful there because I haven't done it from Visual Studio often. So let's go. So this is the root of the directory. This is the full thing that we're going to end up with eventually. But if I do a git checkout tags/start, it will actually give you a warning that you're in detached head mode because you're stepping back. So you're somewhere down the line. If you start editing there, you should create a branch there, but we won't because we're not going to edit anything. So we'll reload everything. And this is the message that you get if you don't have 15.7, but that's a preview version. All right, so let's go here. So this is file new project, but you might notice a couple of new things there, and I'll briefly touch upon some of them. For example, they now have this compatibility version because they're doing new stuff. And this just tells the MVC framework to be compatible with version 2.1. Other stuff that we'll talk about later is the HSTS, so the high HTTP strict transport security, and the HTTPS redirection, which is the new stuff that is easier to do now. You might probably have seen that other than that, there's this create default builder, which builds up this web host with all these plumbing installed. And we'll rip that apart in a moment, because this is good if you want to get started easily. But if you want to take control of things, then you need to be aware of what's happening inside. So that's this part. So nothing fancy. If you press F5, you just get the default values controller. We're going to skip over that. So the next thing is, I'll take you to the next step. So we'll do, let me see. Tags/user secrets. And this introduces a couple of things. But it should be reloading. Yes to all. So let's see what I did. So up here, for example, this was already there just a moment ago, is that there's this SDK, Microsoft Net Core app, and it's 2.1 preview 2 with some number. This number is related to the SDK version, but the SDK version is 2.1.300 and some number. That will probably stay approximately the same, but the preview 1, 2, and in the end final will be there. This is like this meta package that is there for .NET Core applications. Then there's the ASP.NET Core specific ones that add additional stuff, and those are usually prefixed now or postfixed with preview to final. And one thing I added was this refit library. So the first stage of what we're going to do is we're going to make the call from our web API to that genderized web API. And the genderized web API will take a name and predict whether its gender is male or female. So Alex, for example, in the Netherlands, in Ukraine, it's close to 100% being masculine. But some names like Kim can be a female in America or male. And in Norway, for example, it's 100% male. Everybody Kim is male. So I thought it would be nice to know if we're imagining these things with family trees that you can analyze names and we're calling external services. So one of the things I started to do is I took apart the create default builder, and I included all of the things that are actually inside there. So it's talking about using Kestrel, reading some configuration, so you can actually configure how Kestrel is being hosted from your app settings JSON file. There's things about validating scope for the dependency injection system, where you can see that if the hosting environment is development, they actually validate your scopes, but not afterwards. I'm just naming things so you can make mental notes and know what they're about. But this is what it looks like on the inside, and we want to take control because some of the things, like in startup, we want to put here. So we want to be in control of how we rev things up. So there's a couple of things that I added here, but let's go first to the controller, because that's where we want to call the external web API. And this is what I used. So I used this, and I'll explain this in a moment. But the genderize, let me see if I can quickly show you how that works. API.genderize. So give me a good name that I can... Anyone? What's your name? Oh, wow. Spell it out for me, please. Like that? D-I... This is good? Okay. We don't do the country with that, but let's go for Dima. Oh. Let me see. Single use. Oh, it should be. Let's hope. If it doesn't work, then we'll just pretend that it works. Oh, there we go. So maybe make it a bit. So probably you're masculine by 61%. But anyway, there's at least 101 occurrences of Dima being, well, okay, anyway, so this is just for fun. I think we are not in doubt here. But calling this web API, they do have some documentation, but there's nothing else other than that they're saying, you know, this is for single use. You should do name equals something. You get some results. You can do this with these multiple things, but you can also include a country code. But it's all written up. You need to think about it yourself on how to call it. Should you encounter that, you probably want to write your own proxy or a service agent calling into that thing. One of the libraries that I found very useful is Refit, because with Refit, I can just make up a signature of a function that should be able to call that API. So it takes a name from the documentation I read that you can also add an API key, which is a secret, because if you pay for it, you can do more requests per day. But this is, we call it at the root. This is how I want to call it, get gender for name. And this will be translated into the query string. That's all done by the Refit library. It's async by nature, and it returns me a string. It's not entirely true because we saw it was a JSON object, but for now we just have a simple way of calling it, and we take the output as a single string. All right, with that. All I need to do now is call this factory method, REST service, that's from the Refit library, and then for my interface, give it a base URL, which is the API genderized.io, and then I call the function, and that's it. That's all I need to do, and it's all taken care of under the covers. So pretty good, because that saves me from having to figure it out by myself. I'm taking these options here for the base URL from the options. Let's see what the options are about. And this is where I think you can do better with the configuration system, because what I did was I also introduced these options class, just a snippet that goes well with everything related to this web API. Because in my app settings, there you can see that if I create an object with that name and then add the properties in there as key value pairs, I can actually refer to these. I keep them nicely together instead of all separate settings. But also, I can use the configuration system in ASP.NET Core 2.1, and it's been there for a while. But this is how I'm not getting it just from my JSON file. There's also the development JSON where I can override it. Here, I'm for development purposes, I'm switching to the secure one just to demonstrate that that works. But in my startup, I'm actually saying, okay, so read the app settings JSON, take the app settings with the environment name. So if it's development, it will take that one, and bring it all together, and then add the environment variables. So I can even do a set on my environment variables, and that will overrule whatever was said before. But the API key, just imagine I would have paid, and I would have put the API key in my app settings JSON here. You could all call the web API, because this is on GitHub, and I don't want to store my things there. Not everybody is aware of the fact that if you go to your project and you click Manage User Secrets, what will happen is inside of your project, they will administer this unique GUID. Let me just show you that where it happens. It's this thing here, your property settings, property group for the project. And then you have this file, secrets.json, and in the folder, you can actually see that number being used. It's on your file system, it's outside of your source directory, but it contains all your secrets. So here I have my instrumentation key that we will use later. Here I could put my API key. I haven't done it because I haven't paid for it, and as soon as I put it there, it will pick it up. And if I specify it, it will say invalid key, even if I leave it empty. So I left it out, but here you would typically say something like API key, referring to the property name of the class that I was in. So that would be this one, developer API key. That's what I should have specified. And in my code, the one final thing, because I can read this from the configuration system, but I need to do just a little bit here, and it's this one, configure. Genderize API options, and I give it the section that I want to read. And that will make sure that it's deserialized, put into this options object, and that options object will be inserted into my controller because I ask it to. And I chose the I options snapshot. You can do I options, but options are only determined at startup. The I options snapshot will be done whenever it's evaluated. So this is good if you want to be able to change production settings. You can just change the file without having to redeploy. Sometimes you need to do if there's a bug fix to be done, or if there's a logging level to be changed, and you can just change it and it will pick it up automatically. So that's a good thing to have. But you can do I options if you just want to read static values. So that's our options. Then I can just read the base URL, the developer key. I call the function, and let's, for once, just quickly roll this and see if it works. So I'm hosting it here. So it will start up now. You can see that on ASP.NET Core 2.1, there's also this HTTPS that's now being used as a hosting URL. And there's nothing here, so that's kind of boring. But we should be able to do... And I believe I did it like, we'll do Dima again, see if that works. See? So same results, but we were just outputting it as a string. So it's pretty primitive, but enough for now. We did facilitate the refit, and we need that part. We did talk about the user secrets. Keeping the secrets in a safe place. If you want to do that for production, you need something like a cloud provider's safe storage. HashiCorp has a thing, Azure has Key Vault, AWS has their own version. That's where you will probably want to use it for afterwards. So I hope that I have all the slides in order, but we can easily check because the truth is in here. Let me quickly go to the history. Stop this. Go back. I'm just checking if the user secrets is the right one. Health checks, that's the next one. Because even though we don't have much in place yet, we should yep, reload. We want to know about how is our application doing. So you need some way to ask your web API, how are you faring? Let's see. So what I did, I included some NuGet packages. But they are not, well, they are available, but there's like these different versions. It's still maturing. So what I did is I took a couple of implementations from GitHub by Microsoft, which have actual health checks. You'll find that there's a package, Microsoft ASP.NET Core diagnostics.healthcheck, and that has a lot about the health checks. It's sort of what is in this part here. 15 minutes, oh man. That's what is in that package, but it doesn't contain actual health checks. So you want something like the checks like a numeric check or a system check or a URL check. So in this case, we want to check if the Genderized IO is actually reachable, because if not reachable, then we are not doing okay because we are relying on an external resource. So I added them now as source code, but there will be packages available later. And usually it's about revving it up somewhere either in the startup here. So here we have use health check /health. That's the endpoint that we will be able to listen to. And in my startup, I will have this method here that I created, configure health. And inside the health, we're doing this genderized options base URL. We're taking the base URL, we're adding a URL check. So if we get a response, normally if it's a 200 okay, it will be good. But in this case, if we just call the api.genderized.io, it will give a 422 status code, which is unprocessable entity. So you're free to change your check to whatever you want to have. So in this case, if I get an unprocessable entity, I know it's not good, but I know it's alive. So I think that we're healthy then. If we run this application now, because the rest of the plumbing is already done, then all of a sudden we can ask our API at the endpoint health. So we're getting some output there. There we go. And in this case, we're healthy. So with this, what you can actually do, sometimes it's called a ping method because this gives you just simple healthy, unhealthy, unknown, or whatever, or just that they're struggling. There's different words for that as well. You can have some tests running that periodically check the health endpoint and start raising alerts if it's no longer healthy. And we might get back to that, but something like Application Insight is able to do such a thing. Okay, so that was that. Let's stop this, go to the next part. So that's about documentation, because you saw that it was kind of hard to call an external API if you don't really know how it behaves. And this one was so small that it was doable, but if it's bigger, so documentation. Open API is the new standard. It used to be called Swagger, for those of you who know that, but it's now being taken away from the tooling. That's still called Swagger, but the specification is Open API. And we're currently at 2.0 and 3.0 is in the works. Microsoft is investing heavily also with the 2.1 release of ASP.NET Core because they believe that you should be doing this. Any people who think that we might be going back to the SOAP versus WSDL files, because it kind of is similar, right? But that's actually what's happening. So if you want to follow along, you do Open API and okay. Then there we go. So what I did, I mentioned that Swashbuckle is a very popular library, and Microsoft, the internal team, is contributing to NSWAG by Rico Suter. It's on GitHub, obviously, as open source. So what happened here? First of all, I added this library, NuGet package, NSWAG, ASP.NET Core, and that has a lot of stuff in there. That it's referring to, so all this NSWAG stuff with which allows you to generate an Open API document based on your code. So that's a good thing. You can take an assembly even and generate it from it. And it can also do all this stuff by generating from an Open API document, .NET clients, TypeScript clients. There's a lot of things there. So that's kind of good. It loops into ASP.NET Core. And we'll have a look at what we did to build that. So it takes a couple of things. First of all, you need to do some documentation around your web API. So ASP.NET Core 2.1 has better semantics to figure out what this action result of string, that it will actually produce a string. So that's new in 2.1. You should be able to see that you need less of these attributes, where you say, okay, if I'm producing a 200 code and it gives you a string, I'm producing a 400 code, that's what my method is producing. At the top level, we don't have anything here yet, but here you can specify what types of content you are producing, so application / XML, application / JSON. With these things here, this will be metadata for the documentation. So this will actually help you or NSWAG to produce the output. And the output is produced because we're doing two things. So first of all, you do this add Swagger, which adds all this dependency injection, registrations, so things work. And then after that, you add this to the part where you configure your middleware pipeline. So you say use Swagger UI. This will produce both the Open API document, but also the test interface that you can use to test drive your application. There are some things in there like what the endpoint, how it should be reached, the description, title, and this will all be used for code generation as well. So this is kind of important to keep track of what these titles are. If we run this now, oh, and I also did the following while this is revving up. I also, for convenience sake, switch to the use MVC with default route, because that allows me to add a home controller, which redirects me to the Swagger endpoint, which is registered. So if I go to the root of the web API, I will be redirected to the Swagger documentation or the UI. But I don't want this to appear in the documentation itself, so I'm ignoring this from a Swagger standpoint. So this is what happened with the home controller. Get rid of that, and then it just redirects here automatically. If you haven't seen this, this allows you to do, Dima, you're the victim today. So, but then you see that it actually gives me back a string. You can see that it's encoded, so it's not actual JSON. We'll fix that later on. But this is a way to quickly test your application. Document it, so there's a documentation there. Here's documentation, so it's more, and it's fairly easy if you just attribute with the metadata, and then it should be good. How are we doing in time? Oh, we're done. Oh, 7. Oh, okay. Good. Yep. So that, then resiliency. This I think is a cool part, because resiliency means you are you can actually withstand or don't suffer as much if something breaks. You know how to deal with things that break. Transient errors is the term. So transient means that it will go away eventually. At least you hope, because otherwise you have a serious issue. But like a database connection might be disconnected all of a sudden, but you can retry and then probably you will recover. That's what transient errors are about. They are there briefly, but they will probably recover, especially in the cloud. That usually happens. So for resiliency, there's a couple of patterns. The retry pattern is one. You have a retry and back off, because you don't want to retry too fast. You want to retry, and after a while you probably give up. There's also another one that's called circuit breaker. Circuit breaker is an interesting one. If you have this quality of so if you're making all the calls, they only fail once every time. So a retry will be good, but they fail so often that after a while you're like, it's gonna fail no matter what. So I'll just cut the connection because it's just too much pain. So the circuit breaker flips, just like the electricity in your house, and then after a while they will retry. So circuit breaker is good if you want to do fail immediately, instead of trying to make a connection for 60 seconds and then it fails. So you can say, okay, it failed too much, so we'll cut it off. A lot of the SDKs for Azure and all have retry mechanism built in. But we want to have that for our external call. So let's go there. Like that. All right. And this is where the refit library, the Httpclient Factory, and Poly comes in. So in the project here, if this is there we go. There's Poly. And Poly is this parrot. It's the icon or the logo for the Poly library. It's very popular. I highly recommend it if you're doing .NET development. So there's Poly. That's used by Microsoft to create these extensions on the HTTP. And Microsoft Extensions HTTP is the new Httpclient Factory. So I'll show you what the client factory is about, and then we'll talk about Poly. Here we go. And I'll quickly get rid of this. So you don't see that. So the idea is that this is the Httpclient Factory. Because if you ask for an HTTP client and it's dependency injected, you will get a vanilla flavored one with some settings and you don't know about it. So this client factory, you can actually say, okay, I want to have a certain base address for my client configured. I want to have timeouts configured. I want to have request headers preset, all on this HTTP client. And I give it a name, Genderized, because that's the one that I'm calling. And this is the specialized HTTP client to make those calls. So whenever I ask for an HTTP client from the factory with the name Genderized, I get this pre-configured one. So that's one part of it. That's the Httpclient Factory. But a lot of objects that make calls on your behalf will usually accept an HTTP client in their constructor. So it's being injected refit takes one as well. So the refit library can actually accept this HTTP client and put it inside of the proxy that was automatically generated for us. So we get the pre-configured one. So, and I'll get rid of these two lines so that you can see. That's what is called a typed client. A typed client is a client that accepts an HTTP client as a constructor parameter. And you will actually use some other object with a client inside. So here you will see that if you do add typed client on top of the HTTP client call, you can say, okay, this is how my client, the one here, how it should be used to construct a type object. And in this case, the type object that is returned here is this genderized client, because refit just gives you something based on the interface that we defined. So you don't know what it is, it's dynamically generated. genderized client, it still applies. All right, and after that you can use poly, and poly is a way to define policies on how to deal with certain errors. So typically in poly you would do this fluent API where you say, okay, handle these type of exceptions, then do a retry without some of the words, but it's actually handle exception of this type, .retry, .timeout, .fallback, .circuit breaker. That's the way poly works. And they've, in the extensions HTTP poly NuGet package, they've said, okay, so we'll take policy handlers for you, which are defined here. So this is all poly stuff. I'm defining a timeout policy here. So if there's a timeout on an HTTP response message type call, after 1500 milliseconds, I want you to time out. And I'll store it in this registry that is called timeout. I'm adding the policy there. I can also do it without the, so I can do all these other policies, but just make them up as I go along. But if you want to reuse them, you can use a registry. And this one is also interesting. This is if you get the 408 or 500 type errors, this will actually be called. So in this case, I'm saying, okay, if we get a 500 error calling it, it's probably transient, so we'll go away, retry it 3 times. But if you want to retry it some other computed way, it's all these, you can use these overloads that allow you to, there's 10 overloads to really think about what the delegates call on a retry, on if we give up, you can add your own custom logic there, even logging. So I'm not going to demonstrate this because we're out of time, but the final part that I will show is that our call in the family name controller still has this genderized client that is being inserted. Or it does have it now. So, but this is the one that will be constructed by the Httpclient Factory as a typed client into refit with all the policies applied. So this call that I was able to factor out now, get gender for name, although it's very clean, actually has timeouts and retry mechanisms applied to it for this particular client. So this is, I think, one of the biggest parts of ASP.NET Core 2.1, that they have the support built in. You could build it yourself, but now it's just so easy. We're out of time, so we'll take a coffee break, stretch our legs, and we'll be back after this for the second part. Okay, see you in a bit. Okay. How are you guys doing, girls, guys? Good? Okay. Let's try to get through it. I just checked that we're about halfway through, so it's actually not doing, we're not doing too bad. I'm not doing too bad with getting you through this stuff. So I had a question during the break on how would I deal with connections with 2 databases instead of making HTTP calls that we showed with the Httpclient Factory. If you're using any framework, it has retry mechanisms built in, so you can simply configure during your creation of your DB contexts on how you want the retry mechanism to be used. But for all other purposes, you can try poly separately. So you can wrap every call that you make with poly. It's about the parrots, it's a .NET Foundation open source thing. But this is like all the policies that are there that I talked about, circuit breaker, bulkhead, caching. And Well, I won't show you everything, but the idea is that you define your policies, for example, to handle the type of exception. It could be a timeout connection on your database connection, and do retry or something more intelligent. But finally, you will just execute your policy and make your call, the call that does what it does supposed to do. And it's all wrapped around it. So it's like a decorator pattern that applies the policy on top of your call. You can do this for everything. And you can handle exceptions, and you can handle return results from your calls that you're making. All right, just so know that you can use the poly library outside of what we just saw. Then we should be going here. We talked about the resiliency. Oh, I didn't show you the final bit because, and it's a matter of taste. But when I made the call, I told it that I would handle timeouts and I would handle server exceptions. So this is the request exception and the timeout rejected exception. That's where the poly mechanism intervenes and says, okay, it's taking too long. Even though the HTTP client might try for longer, the policy will interrupt it, and you need to catch those exceptions. You could also put that inside of your policy, so you don't have to do this everywhere you make the call, but that's a matter of choice. Do you want to be explicit in this place, or do you want to have it in your policy and used everywhere where you're using your policy? Yeah, so that. Then about versioning, because you will go from one version of your API to the next, and you will probably break things along the way if you're unlucky, or if you just need to add new functionality. So let's see what things are there to do the versioning in your application. Let me see if it's stopped. Yep. So we'll go to versioning. There we go. So with the versioning, I added this library that's also usable not just from ASP.NET Core, but also from ASP.NET. It's this MVC versioning that we have here. Let's make it a little bit bigger. It's currently at 2.2.0. That's the latest one. If you add that to your project, you can do some versioning. And the idea is that in your startup, during the configuration of your dependency things, there we had the OpenAPI versioning. Let's go to that one. So you can say, okay, the default API version that we're working with now is 1.0 because we don't have a 2.0 yet, but it's a good thing to have this in place anyway. If it's not specified, you can assume the default version. And you can report API versions, meaning that if you have more than one, it will be put in the headers that there's other versions of the API available. Especially if you're using, or if you're having two versions of it, 1 and 2, from your 1 version, you could actually say, you know, there's a 2 version. And the deprecated ones are also output as HTTP headers in your response. So that's the stuff that you need to do, nothing more than that, other than that I need to specify some versioning. So in this case, I've decorated this with API version 1.0. So this controller is part of API version 1.0. It used to be 0.9. It's deprecated now. That's your design, your choice. That this supersedes this now, and your routing will differ because your routing you can choose various mechanisms to indicate how you should deal with versions. One is them from the URI. One is from the query string with a question API version equals. That's what Microsoft uses. It also uses this versioning with the version number being specified inside of the URL. And you can use HTTP headers with accept headers indicating specific types that you accept with your version in it, or custom headers. Those are the types. If you want to do this and stick to what Microsoft is doing, they have API REST design guidelines, and there's a whole section on versioning where they have the versioning schemes, but they also have group names. And group names are like dates, which bundle together a lot of API versions. If you used Azure before, you'll see that they use the date type of versioning, which are group names. I believe you can even see it if you specify versions. Maybe not this one. Let me check. If you do new API version somewhere, I believe. There you have the group version. Not sure if it's visible. There, group version. But you can also use group versions and major minor versions. So all these combinations are there. Like so. Let's give this a spin. So if I'm hosting this now, then you'll still see this thing already had the v1 in it. But now my URLs are becoming API/v1.0. v1 will also work. So if you take that directly, I think that will be in here, v1.0, family name. What was it, Dimitro? Was that your full name? Okay. Oh. Oh. Now you're 100% male all of a sudden. Good. Okay. So that is the versioning. So at least you have it in there, and that we will use later if we go to multiple versions. So there is more to be done. All right. Let's move on. Time is short. So this thing is, I called it client SDKs, software development kits, but it's where you as a publisher of a web API also provide the means to connect to it easily, because otherwise you make people do the work to call your API in a proper way, but you could actually generate that for them or create that for them, so it's easier for them to consume your web API. If you're your own consumer, it might not be as necessary, but still, I recommend doing this because we'll be doing some contract testing with this as well. All right, let's see how I can demonstrate this, because if I check out that file, client SDKs, SDK, is that it? Yep. Reload, because now there's a new project in there. So this is what I used. It's almost automated. You can improve on this and feel free to suggest things. But this is a PowerShell script where I first do a web request and get to the Swagger JSON endpoint. That's the JSON file that describes my web API. We looked at the pretty UI with the green things in it. But if you actually want the raw metadata for your service, your open API, this would be the call. It gets stored as a file. And then I call this library called AutoRest. If you go to AutoRest, it's by Microsoft. So I'm not sure about the URL, but let's just guess that it's this one. Nope. Then we'll do GitHub AutoRest, Azure AutoRest. So this is by Microsoft, and this is a very large, big generator for generating libraries that can consume things that have been specified in OpenAPI. So this is the logo for reference. You need to install it. I refer to this in the installation notes on the README file for this workshop. So you can install this, and once you do, now I might break things here, but let's just be adventurous. Now let's see this one, and I'll just take this call here. So we move to PowerShell for a second. And I call this AutoRest. What it will do is it will just start generating stuff based off of the input file, which is the v1 web API JSON file. And now it has generated the files that should be in... It's not connected yet. Wait up, wait up. I'll add it here. So this is what it generated. So it generated this genealogy web API. That's where the name came in from, which I referred to earlier. So it's this, all this code is being generated. It has interfaces for the individual web APIs that are specified and further implementation. But from this, we can actually start calling the web API that we have. So let's see. Is that clear what happened here? So I just took the specification and I generated all this stuff, and that's my client proxies to be able to call it. The next thing that you can do with that is, because once you have this, you can do, it defines your contract, right? So you have your Swagger Open API specification, you generated it at this point in time, your web API will start evolving, but you want to see if this client SDK still works, because as soon as it doesn't work anymore, if it gives you errors calling your web API, you know that you broke your contract. So this is how you can get that into your pipeline, just by adding tests that will check with the client SDK of a particular version if your web API is still compliant. So let's get that done. We'll do exit here, and then we'll do the contract one. There we go. Okay, discard. So what I did now is, this is where I already added the client SDK. And I added this integration tests with it. And let me see if I have everything there. Yeah, I added one small thing, and you could tweak the generator, but I needed something to insert this HTTP client. So what I want to do now is call the web API. And this is actually the call to the client, get async. This is just as a get call on my client. So this does a call to the thing that gave us mail with a probability. Here's the same one. So this is even how you can do it very specifically. So the proxy, family name, and then make the call. That's how I make the call with the client SDK, which should work if they're still compatible. If I break things, this will go bad. And one of these asserts will just say, okay, this is not working anymore. So how do you execute a call to your web API from a unit test? Because these are unit tests. They're integration tests. That's also something new on ASP.NET Core 2.1. I believe 2.0 already had the first parts of it. What I did was, in this integration test, I added a dependency to this one, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Test Host. That's a specialized library that Microsoft provides to do in-memory hosting. So you can call your web API without the network overhead of it, but you will actually make an HTTP call on your web API. So that's the part where it's integration testing. But in this case, you could do formal integration tests, but in this case, I just want to know if I call it and I give you a payload, will you give me an answer that I can deserialize again? That's the contract part. I don't want to test the implementation behind it. So let's see what we need to do for that. So to get started, I have these variable declarations there. This is the web API from the client SDK. And this is what I need to do. So I'm telling it to create a new test server where I provide a builder. Remember the create default builder? This is the similar type of builder. And I will create an HTTP client from it. And that I will insert into my proxy. So it's a special prepped HTTP client that will call without network stuff happening. But this is the beauty. So I'm using my environment of choice. I could say production or development. It's whatever is used in ASP.NET. And I'm using the startup, but the startup is the startup from my web API project, this file here. So it's this startup that I'm using. It does all the dependency injection, all the registrations of logging factories and so on. But I do want to get rid of the call that we had to the Genderized API, because if I'm making the external call, my test might fail. I still need network connectivity. that I want to get rid of. So what I do is, after my use startup, it has been registered with the official refit client where we did all the policy stuff, remember? I'm getting rid of that, so I'm saying just use this mock thing. And the mock thing is just something that I created, and it just says Alex. You know, I just give it some result which is deserializable. And that way I will override with configure test services, I will override any previous registrations. So I'm getting rid of the old one that does the refit thing, and this one just gives me a fake one. And then we start calling it. And I hope that these things work now. Let's see. Because this is how you would run them. I'm checking if the Swagger documentation is available, and I'm checking if the family name actually gives me a result which I can deserialize. And it happens to be true for now. But this is where you can start evolving, because now you can change your implementation. You can even change some of the parameters in your action methods. But as soon as you go overboard and it becomes incompatible, these will fail. And then you need to do something, like upgrade your major version and build a new separate version from it. Or just send a mail to your client saying, I'm sorry, but we broke the API. You need to rebuild all of your applications. That's not as nice. All right, the next one, logging. Oh, that's where your question comes in. Let's see if we can get there. So the logging part. And you would be amazed how people will not do logging or do logging in a less structured way. So my point here is that if we go to the logging, there we go. That logging is fairly simple to get set up, and probably you've already done that. Just want to point out a couple of things. So in your startup, let's see, the logging is at the bottom, right here. So you will ask for a logger factory, and then you can start adding these logging providers, which I always find confusing, because logging providers seem like they're providing something, but actually they're consuming something. They're sinks. Some frameworks call them log sinks. And you add whatever you want to have. So there's the debug. That will end up in your debug window. Console will end in the output console. So if you're running in Kestrel, you will actually see that happening. And then you have the event source logger, which does event tracing for Windows. If you're running on Windows, because as the name suggests, it's only available on Windows. It goes to somewhere nothing if you're running on anything other than Windows. But it's a cross-platform to some extent. It will not crash on other platforms than Windows. But these are the things that you might choose. There was a question on how do you get your logging information and the retry stuff and the client factories. It's not in this one yet, but in the next version, I believe I added application insights as a logging thing. So we'll have to wait for that a bit. One other thing that is good to know is that you can have your logging defined here. So you can say, okay, for everything of the providers, the logging, the default level is warning. And I'm not sure if I in this version already have, oh yeah, this is the more for development purposes. I want that everything from Microsoft is actually at warning. So if the log category starts with Microsoft, I will want levels of warning, which are higher levels, so you get less messages. But the default debugging in my output window from Visual Studio, I want everything to be information, so a lot of information flowing there. This is how you can tweak for each of the sources in this way. So it's again the cascading mechanism to override it for your development purposes. This refers to the name of the log provider. Oh yeah, and then there's another important one, and this is the part that might be new. If we go to the controller, we go here. This one. This is actually the one that also already has multiple versions. But here I should have added some logging. This is the standard one. You pick your log level, and it shouldn't matter to where you want to log because you don't know. It's up to the configuration to add log sources. But the good part here is that if you want to log more information, you should do this. And you might think this is string interpolation, where this requires a $sign in front, but it's not. It's actually a log message template. So this thing, as you can see, it doesn't even correlate with name, but name will be put in that place positionally. If you do this, and if your log source or log provider supports it, you can do semantic logging, or also known as structured logging, which means that they log both of these things. They don't make a single string out of it and log that, because that's really, really hard to start to aggregate across multiple servers, multiple hosts, aggregate all the log information, and then you want to know, okay, show me all the information where the family name was Dimitru. Yeah? And you wouldn't know, because you need to do the string parsing, and on this application, this machine, it's actually logged as name. There it's family name, but it's somewhere inside of the string. But in this case, they store, if your log provider supports it, they store the template, which has family name as a thing, and they store the value separately. And if you do those together, then you can actually query for log messages that have family name in it. Not the value, but the fact that there's family name curlies in it. Or you can just say, okay, across all the log messages, give me all the family names equals to Alex. And it's much more powerful, and it only takes a bit of effort to do it like this. So don't do the $sign for string interpolation. Don't do string format. That will create a single string that you need to parse. This is the good way to do it. Serilog supports this, and Application Insights. Those are the two that I know about. There might be more, but I just don't know them. All right. So that's logging. We'll skip over because we are pressed for time. So then we go to the monitoring part, because it's all good that it's running and you know it's up in the cloud, and then you don't know how it's doing. So you want some metrics there. So let's see if this we can also get this to work. So we'll do the monitoring. So in my case, I used Application Insights. You can also use AppMetrics, which is a commercial provider that does metrics and also some health things. There's AppRelic, New Relic, that also does these things. So there's multiple people, companies that actually provide these things. But we'll use Application Insights. And you're free to choose something else, obviously. All right. A little bit of bootstrapping. So in your startup, if you go to your application, right here, you can usually click this, and there will be Application Insights here. There's also this little drop-down that says that you can enable Application Insights or configure it. It hooks it up so you can actually do it from Visual Studio, which might be interesting. We might try that. Then we have, let me see, a bit in the, normally it will put things in the program CS. Somewhere around here it will add use Application Insights, but I've moved it somewhere here, there, because in here I can actually specify the level of logging that I want it to trigger at. So in this case it's information and above, warning, error, and so on. You also need the instrumentation key. You already saw that I had it in my user secrets stored somewhere down there, and then all of a sudden things should appear there. But because I'm using Application Insights, everything gets looped together. Let me see if I haven't forgotten anything. Oh yeah, this is the part where the rest besides the logging also gets bootstrapped. That's right here. So in this case, little trick, I'm retrieving the hosting environment from the service provider, which I'm building here. And then I can say, if this is development, I want the developer mode to be enabled, which normally it's buffered for a period, and then the trace messages are sent out, but this makes sure that they get sent out on every trace message, which is good for developing and debugging purposes. Instrumentation key is set, and let's just run this, and let's see what happens. So I should be going to And we could try the Visual Studio, but I'll just guide you to the portal. Let's see where we're at. And the good thing is that every application that has this instrumentation key will all get their data aggregated. So from your phone client, Android or iOS, to your SPA web applications, to your web APIs, to your database servers, all the Azure resources, it's all put together in Application Insights. And if we go to the resource group that we need for this, there's the building web APIs. And now we should start making a call, because otherwise it wouldn't make much sense. Oh yeah, I changed something, which it didn't remove, I think. Let me see. Oh yeah, I remember. It's now v2. Did I stop it? I stopped it. So this is the v2 version. I can trigger it from here as well. Is there a female name somewhere? Can you like that? Okay. Female. Okay, we're good. We're good. Well, this is scary stuff, right? What if it said male? So we have all these things here. One thing. Remember the call that we made with the client factory? That genderized name that was in the HTTP client when we did the poly and the other things will actually appear as part of your log category. So this seemed to work. Let's trigger it a couple of times more. So let's see. And now we go to this one here. First of all, you can get an application map, which is also useful for the insights. This doesn't show much. That's kind of boring. Usually it gets all the dependencies in place. We'll go to the live metric stream, which we'll connect to now. And then we should be seeing what is happening there. And I'll make it a little bit smaller. It actually says here one server online. And as you can see, if I make it bigger again, it's the desktop machine that I'm running at here. So now that we're connected and we go to execute a couple of things anymore, if my mouse comes back, yep. So try that and let's see. With a bit of luck, you should see all of the things coming in. If I click it a couple of times more, maybe do some weird stuff. There we go. So you will actually there. You can see that there's 404s that appear. You can see the other trace information. It's all called trace, but some of them are just log categories of information or warning. What was your question again on? Can you repeat it? Oh, yeah. So from Poly, what we did now is we only handled exceptions that got logged, but it's kind of hard to trigger them because the API is available. But we did do some logging there with, we're making the call to, let's see if I can find it. Here, this is the one. Acquiring name details for Marta. See, that was in the log information call, and it's there now. And because we mentioned it, let's do this. And this is the tricky part, but let's see. Oh, I know. Analytics. You need to click Analytics. Oh, 5 minutes. So you can actually query all the information that is there. Now I did store that somewhere. Let's hope it's in the right place, this one. Let's just pick the traces first. There we go, and then take 20 and run it. Let's see if we can find the acquiring details for Marta. You can see that this is the composed message, but if you look a bit further, I hope, custom measurements, no, custom dimensions. This is in here somewhere. You can actually see that still family name. Oops, sorry about that. Family name. And then somewhere further to the back, it's family name Marta. So this is where the semantic or structured logging kicks in. And I could, if all goes well, I hope this is the right syntax, but let's see. Oh, it's, maybe it's like this. There we go. So now you can see that we actually got through all the log messages and only picked out the ones that have this family name property and a particular value. But you can, do as you see fit. Okay, with only 3 minutes or so left, I believe we're at the final thing. So we're actually doing pretty good. Feature toggles. Because you need to go into production, and sometimes I hear about people doing the DTAP stages, so development, test, acceptance, production. And one of the newer things is to release to production all the time. But you want to be careful if you release something that the new stuff, you can actually execute it or switch it off, which is where feature toggles come in. So let's do that final bit. And I'll rush through this just a little bit because we're running out of time. I hope this is the one. Yep. Oh, and I might need to do it because I noticed that you will run into this as well. Accidentally, I removed the V2 controller. So I'll need a different version. So let me quickly get, oh, I'll just do the last one. That's probably better. So if you're going to go back to where we're at, it's master. And I did some other tweaks, which we'll not be talking about. Okay. So there we go. What I did was I picked my library of choice. In this case, it was feature toggle, which allows me to define these toggles, these switches on and off. There's multiple of them because you can have the ones that are on in particular date ranges during the week. Sometimes they're just on if you configure them to be on. And there's always on, always off, which is interesting. And I can explain in a bit. What you would do is in your startup, again in your startup, you would do the features and you would register this provider, app settings provider, because you want to read them from the app settings. And then you define a singleton object of some types. And this type I define just by deriving from the one that I wanted to use. Simple is on or off, defined by my app settings. And in my app settings, I have this feature toggle that says advanced health equals true. You could do this inside of your actions, of your methods, to have different types of logic. In this case, I decided that the feature that I wanted to do inside of the startup, I wanted to do a bit about the health configuration. And the health, all of a sudden, if this feature, which I'm retrieving from the service provider, is enabled, I add these memory checks to it as well. So I'm doing more checking. I want to release this production, and I want to, during development, I will use an always off switch toggle, because then it will never be executed. If I'm comfortable and it's working, it's finished, then I will do it like this, so I can put it on or off while in production. And after a couple of releases, when I'm like, oh, this is working, I don't have to switch it off again, because you would only do so if you switch it on. You could do application insights or whatever, monitoring your system, because just switching it on and everything stays working is not the best indicator. You would want to look at memory pressure and I/O, because if that increases all of a sudden, like, whoa, switch it off. You can switch it off. But after a while, it behaves, it's good. So we will use the always on toggle You might think, why would you do that? Because that makes it really easy to do a typed search across your code to get rid of this technical debt. Because typically, feature toggling is this if statement. But if this is always on and it's been in there for a while, it's stable, I can just search my code where I'm using the always on feature and just get rid of it. And then I get rid of all the technical debt. So with this, we have the ability to release to production every time and test in production, because you can do A/B testing and have one side, the A side, doing without the toggle and the other one with the toggle switched on. And you can see if it behaves and transfer more and more load. You know, that is how you can test it while in production. Dark launching is another strategy, but this works as well. So we're out of time. So we covered most of this. The slides will be available. You have the bit.ly link that gets you to the GitHub repo that has all the instructions to get started and how to do what I did. Just get inspiration from this. Know about all these things, which I think make it more professional or more robust or production ready. And then you can do the things that you love, add this to it, and you should be good for the future. Thanks, everyone. Do we have time, or is it time's up? Okay, 5 minutes. So, questions?
I have a question. You talked about testing the server integration test.
Yeah.
And then call class with API. In our life, we should use login and class for access to API. How I can call the API in integration test?
Okay, so your question is if I'm running this, but I'm using authentication as part of the security.
Authentication for in-text.
Okay, let me think of strategies on dealing with that, because what we see is that you have multiple authentication methods, maybe other ones than just getting tokens, for example. Sometimes they have a simple token provider available. Sometimes they spin that up in test scenarios as well, because with something like Identity Server you could. Or you loophole it so you can switch it off, but that's kind of dangerous because, you know, or just acquire it. What we do at the customers that we're at, we actually do take a dependency on an external token service to get a token while testing. So it's an official token, and we cache it internally. And then do all these, you use Postman or run scope, you know, to get these multi-stage calls, first to the token service, get the token and pass it on in your call to make it there. But in this case, I haven't experimented with that just yet, with the test host and doing authentication while in the test host. Because in this scenario, you're only interested about the contract, not about the security kicking in.